order. Welcome to meeting number 30 of the House of Commons Special Committee on the Canada People's Republic of China relationship. Pursuant to the order of reference of May 16, 2022, the committee's meeting on its study of the Canada People's Republic of China relations with a focus on the Asian Infrastructure Bank. First, a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and members. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. Members are attending in person, in the room, and remotely using the Zoom application. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefits of the witnesses and members. Please wait till I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel, and a reminder to keep the earpiece away from the microphone so that we don't thrill the interpreters with feedback. It's not pleasant. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raised hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. I'd like to welcome a couple of visitors on our panel today, or actually in our MP lineup. Mr. Leifert from Calgary is joining us today, and we have actually my neighbor in Langley-Aldergrove, right next to our riding in Fleetwood-Port Kells. Mr. Van Popta is subbing for MP Landsman. So our first panel now, we'd like to welcome Mr. Bob Picard as an individual and allegedly no stranger to these precincts, including this building, but we'll leave that explanation for another time. Mr. Picard, you have up to 5 minutes to deliver your opening remarks.
Let me thank the chair and all members for welcoming me here today to communicate what happened with my experience at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was a traumatic, dramatic, and in my case, it was a very, very patriotic moment because I felt that our membership in this organization was not giving this country a single thing of tangible value that we could proudly explain to people here in our country that their membership in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank would be delivering them back home. Since Xi Jinping proposed the AIIB in 2013, AIIB, it never became well known globally, and what public awareness it did have, it was often tainted by a perceived association with the controversial and increasingly aggressive geopolitical policies of the People's Republic of China, especially the Belt and Road Initiative. It was in this context that I was approached to help build a profile and to shape a positive public image for AIIB. I was asked to join as the bank's global communications chief in late 2021, not long after the two Michaels were released. Having previously served in senior capacities at public relations firms such as Edelman and Burson Marsteller, with 16 years of Asia-Pacific experience, I was well placed to help AIIB communicate its story. But before signing on, I had some concerns about whether the PRC government was exercising undue influence at the bank. Now, AIIB's published governance, it did allay these concerns somewhat, and I was reassured by the presence of Western countries on the shareholders list, including, of course, my own country, our country, Canada. It didn't take me long, though, to realize after joining the bank that the reality of power inside of AIIB does not match the rhetoric. And to see how respected G7 countries like Canada, with a reputation, were brandished like trophy members to help attract Western capital and to avoid hostile policy consequences from U.S. authorities in Washington. Inside of the bank, CCP members wield power in many of the most important positions from the top down. Mr. Jin, the president of the bank, himself a staunch CCP member and former Red Guard, often articulates Chinese government policy as if it were his own. As the bank's spokesperson, I advised him that he should communicate his views as the leader of a multilateral organization and refrain from parroting the PRC government's point of view. Now, even though I was supposedly in charge of all global communications for the bank, I subsequently discovered that Mr. Jin's office, dominated by Communist Party members, was directly involved in crafting messaging with PRC media for the domestic Chinese market that differed from what the bank was communicating in English to overseas audiences. Now, devising public messaging to distinguish AIIB from the controversial BRI, which of course is Xi Jinping's signature #1 most important geopolitical expansion project, it was seen as a critical priority, and that was requested of me directly by President Jin. And yet privately, these two PRC initiatives seemed uncomfortably more intertwined and interrelated than I had been led to believe. In my own department, a CCP member, just imagine this, was appointed as my personal assistant. I found out that this Communist Party member appointed as my assistant was secretly reporting directly to the most senior party member in Mr. Jin's office. This arrangement, to say the least, was outside of the bank's supposed reporting lines. So I had an in-house snitch reporting directly to Communist Party members what was going on. Every journalist I met with, every civil society leader I met with. So, interestingly, in 2022, I'd been there for a number of months at this point, the Communist Party presence in the President's office at AIIB, it was bolstered by the arrival of a new colleague whose job description nobody seemed to know, except that he was supposed to be the new party guy. Within a few months, Mr. Jin's office suite underwent a remodeling. Security locks were installed, controlling the access of all AIIB staff. The bank's vice president, none of them Chinese, needed to be buzzed into his office for the very first time, and that created a lot of resentment internally. This cocooning of the AIIB president is consistent with how the information he receives and the issues he decides are filtered through two CCP officials whose offices were closest physically to his, inside of this bubble. Now, at the AIIB, almost nothing Mr. Jin, the president, sees, says, or does happens without the deep involvement of these two Communist Party officials. And how do I know this? I know this because the communications department, for which I was responsible, was located right next to Mr. Jin's office.
Now, Mr. Picard, your 5 minutes has expired. I'm sure you have more to say, and perhaps you can work that into answers to some of the questions that you'll be receiving, which will...
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Cormier.
Okay, so IT asked me to double check, so I think you can hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
Yeah, we can see you too. There you go. All right, Mr. Seaback, the first 6 minutes are yours.
Mr. Picard, I'm actually going to suggest that you continue where you were so we can get the benefit of your entire statement.
Okay, it's not much longer. I'll go as quickly as I can. Thank you for that. Okay. I would say that the thing to understand here, the key point, is that the AIIB President's Office is unusually powerful, even in the context of a multilateral organization. It's extremely top-down. And that office is a cocoon physically cut off, and it is dominated by senior Communist Party members. So this heel-clicking obedience is the way I would describe it at the President's office. It's valued more highly than any other virtue at the bank, including, notably, freedom of expression, or thinking differently than other people do, which is kind of ironic when you consider it's a multilateral organization. I think that you have to realize that externally, over and over again, externally AIIB says that it's an apolitical, independent organization. But honestly, internally, the atmosphere there in Beijing is anything but. It's political and it's CCP political. There's a big difference between those two. And that has helped to create a toxic culture inside of this organization. Now, when I first resigned last May, citing my concerns about the CCP's pronounced, profound, and pervasive influence in the everyday operating business of the bank and its toxic impact on the culture, Mr. Jin, the president, did not accept my resignation. He talked me out of it. And I was kind of shocked that the bank did not deny and did not confirm my allegations or concerns about CCP influence. I was simply informed that the president's office did not like my raising the taboo CCP topic. After accepting my second resignation in June when I left in a hurry for Japan, the bank started attacking me personally. Journalists covering the news of my departure, some of whom I'd known a long time before I joined the bank, they warned me that bank executives were trash-talking me off the record. And this was well before, of course, any bank investigation took place. Hundreds of pro-AIIB, pro-CCP bots on Twitter targeted me with insults, that I was accused of being an American agent of espionage, a white supremacist, a neo-colonialist, or part of some nefarious Canadian government plot to embarrass China. Which brings me to this. When I announced my departure from the bank, I did not ask the government of Canada to do anything. Period. I acted in an individual capacity out of what I considered to be ethical responsibility and also a patriotic duty, frankly. I have cooperated, though. I have supported the review conducted by the Government of Canada and provided information to the Department of Finance in this regard. Indeed, I note that several of the topics of the extended review mirror concerns that I raised with the Department of Finance on transparent governance, management competence, and proper professional culture at the bank. So finally, this point, when Mr. Xi proposed the AIIB, he was a relatively new leader, still seen as a potential reformer, maybe somebody like Deng Xiaoping in 1978. But now we have a neo-Maoist leader of China, an authoritarian dictator who, well, look, after so much political interference, things look much different than they did then. We all hoped that by placing this bet on a multilateral institution in China, that we could have a window on Asia's development. Well, I think what we have now is a bank for China's influence, where China gets the exclusive geopolitical credit for the lending of the bank.
Mr. Pickard, I want to give you as much time, but I actually do need to ask some questions.
Go ahead.
So first thing I want to ask, you said not giving a single tangible benefit to Canada as a result of the involvement. To the best of your knowledge, has any of the money that Canada has provided to the AIB, has that been refunded back to Canada?
Not that I know. And I don't know the details of that kind of a financial transaction. I did not take documents from the bank when I left AIIB, and I would not have access to that information now.
Are you familiar with the PRC 2017 National Intelligence Law?
Not by that name, no.
Okay.
I'm aware of how business is done in China, but that's a general statement.
The law obligates individuals, organizations, and institutions to assist the PRC security and intelligence services in carrying out a wide variety of intelligence work. So that would apply to all Chinese citizens. So would that sort of mesh with your experience with what went on at the AIIB? It's as a result of the national intelligence law?
Oh, definitely. It's a question of, first loyalty. I believe that it's very clear in the bank that would be the responsibility of the 30 towards 40% of the staff who are Chinese nationals, many of whom are of course, CCP members.
So as you reflect back on the comments you've made about the bank, its structure, the CCP talking points, et cetera, would the fact that this law obligated individuals to behave in a certain way, does that sort of, to excuse the phrase, square the circle for you on why this was going on?
A short answer, please, Mr. Pickard.
I'm sorry?
Short answer?
Yeah, I think so, yes. I believe it's what I saw, what I experienced is consistent with what you're talking about.
Thank you, Mr. Seebeck. And I'll go to Mr. Fragaskaris for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Pickard, for being here today. There's a range of different things that you've outlined for us in your opening statement in the previous round. I just wonder if you could provide us with a summary of the key allegations that you're making, because I have a sense, and based on previous media reports, of where you're coming from, but
sure.
In the testimony, understand the specifics of what you're alleging.
Well, the specifics of what I'm
with
alleging.
Respect to AIIB.
I am alleging undue Chinese Communist Party influence in the everyday operation of the bank. where key positions in the bank, where decisions made in the bank on discretionary spending or, important projects that need approval, who gets the nod on budget projects. There's a whole latitude of everyday operating decisions inside of the bank, which, either go to the board or go through management for like a rubber stamp decision, but are not decided by them. The president's office has a considerable degree of ability inside of the bank to make decisions. Most of what I got approved, keep in mind I ran the communications department, so that's my lens on the AIIB. Almost anything that I was able to get approved for my department, moving to the 10th floor, opening a broadcast media studio, budget increases, 6 new headcounts, out-of-cycle headcounts, all of that was decided by the president's office, not by the management or by the board of the bank.
So that's your main allegation.
My main allegation is that has created a toxic culture inside of the bank where people know that there's a subterranean network of relationships, like the cool kids in school, as it were. I was warned about the power of Chinese Communist Party members in league with each other as a favored class inside of the bank. They have undue power and control inside of the bank, which stifles free expression in the bank and sours the culture. When I joined the bank, I was told there was a crisis of bullying. And in fact, there was an anti-bullying program that the bank was developing at that time, which we called Respectful Workplace after I arrived. The departments that were most concerned with bullying were the departments that were under Communist Party members.
My intent here is not to be combative with you, so please don't take the next question as that.
No worries.
What is the specific evidence that you use to back your allegation? I mean, and I need you to be precise. What evidence would you point to? Is there anything concrete, anything electronic, physical, in terms of evidence that you have?
Well, first of all, I left on my own steam for my own reasons. So I don't feel obliged to provide that kind of a detailed document summary of what it is that I observed. I'm an eyewitness. I have opinions. I saw certain things. I'm sharing certain things. I wasn't sworn in today, but I would swear. But if I had taken documents out of the bank, and people keep on asking me, where are the documents? Well, if I'd taken those documents out of the bank, I'd either be in a Chinese jail right now, or I'd be under serious litigation. So I can tell you openly and transparently everything I saw and experienced. I've given you some case study examples. I wrote a column in The Economist, many different interviews with different anecdotes. But if you're looking for a stack of documents marked confidential with the hammer and sickle on them, you're not going to get them from me.
Okay, so you've seen certain things, is
I
what
have
you're
seen
what you're saying.
Sure.
And
well, Mr. Shi, sure.
Continue. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, the decision on which countries to go to by the bank president, the Central Asia Summit, which was adjacent to Xi Jinping being there. Last year, around the time that I left the bank, there was a decision about where the president would go and what the president would say. And to me, it was very clear there was a geopolitical piggyback to foster Chinese interest. Now, these photographs weren't published. President Jin of the bank was meeting with world leaders, not with the flag of AIIB, but with the flag of the People's Republic of China. I prevented their publication internally at the bank because I felt it would not look good on a multilateral institution for its president to be seen meeting under the Chinese flag. I was ordered to put on the website of a multilateral institution a statement of condolence when Jiang Zemin, the Chinese previous Chinese leader, died. Our department pushed back. We thought that would not be appropriate because, of course, Queen Elizabeth had just died.
Mr. Picard, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You'll have an opportunity to expand on the answer in other rounds, I'm sure.
Sure.
I just have 45 seconds left. When you raised the allegation with government, how quick was the response? Tell me about that engagement.
That's very interesting. That's a good question. As soon as I acted, I heard from the Canadian Embassy in Beijing. And I was in Japan already, and I received a call from an official at the embassy, and he asked me, this is before the government had done anything. It's after I had resigned, after it was in the public domain, and I didn't resign until I was in Japan. And when I was, he was trying to track me down on the phone. And I spoke with him. I don't think we spoke for more than half an hour. And I told him exactly why I was leaving the bank. And a few hours later, I think I was on a flight, and there was the announcement by the government of what it had decided to do to freeze the membership and to review it.
So a very quick response. Thank you.
Yeah,
very
very
much.
quick response.
Yeah, we're out of time for you, Mr. Freigastados. Now, Mr. Picard, are you fluent in French?
Not
Okay, make sure
not
you've got the
anymore.
earpiece and the channel selected, because we're about to turn the floor over to Mr. Bergeron for 6 minutes or less.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Would you say that this is the type of situation that's to be found in other international financial institutions, or was it specific to this one?
I've seen that's a very good question, because defenders of AIIB have said there's nothing to see here, folks. There's nothing to be concerned about with the Communist Party, because Communist Party in Beijing at AIIB, it's just like Republicans and Democrats at the World Bank at Washington. That is a school of opinion. That was a common reaction when I left the bank. Frankly, though, knowing a thing or two about doing business in China and having lived in the United States, I don't think that's a very good analogy. I also happen to have had occasion to see, because of my years in China, how the President's office was working. And I firmly believe that the President's office at AIIB, it is far more powerful and, I would say, strongman focused, top down, very commanding compared to what I understand to be the case at the ADB in Manila or at the World Bank in Washington, for example. Now that made me think that AIIB almost operated more like a domestic Chinese financial institution than like a multilateral. Multilaterals, I mean, all these different countries, all of these different members, they're supposed to cooperate, communicate, not just top-down command, which was what I saw a lot of at AIIB.
Donc, au-delà de la rhétorique,
So over and beyond rhetoric, according to, saying that you'd see something like this elsewhere, you would say that indeed this was very specific to this institution, this investment bank.
Very much so. No, I haven't worked at the World Bank or the EBRD or these other places, but from what I understand, I mean, the MDBs are not like competitors with each other. It's a very small town. Everyone's very friendly. It's very clubby. So, but I understand through what I hear from different people that based on what I have shared, the top-down strongman system at AIIB was far more pronounced than what you would get from the Japanese president of the ADB in Manila or the World Bank in Washington, D.C. That's what I hear. I was at the bank for 15 months, so I can't pretend to be an expert on that.
outre votre démission, outre la réaction du gouvernement,
Other than your stepping down, your withdrawal, and the Canadian government's response, is there anything that can be done, do you think, to reform the AIB, or is it just a lost cause?
I believe that my departure, at the very least, will improve the problems that I identified in terms of, I think that the governance, the competence of management, and the human friendliness of the culture, I think they will be very careful not to make a glaring mistake. But I just got an email before this very committee from one of my sources inside of the bank. And, apparently the foreign employees, when they leave the bank, all of their archives, their records are completely removed from the system. And I feel like the reaction at the bank is to, like, they demoted the communications department. I used to report to President Jin, and I guess they punished the department by forcing the department to report through the corporate secretary. I believe that it's going to be hard for them to recruit foreign talent. But I've had lots of people ask me about my experience, and I've provided transparent, open commentary. I wish many of the people who work there very well. There are some talented, well-educated, very, very impressive people there. And I miss my friends in China, my Chinese friends, who I will never see again, probably, because I can't set foot in that country.
Comment peut-on justifier que le Canada participe?
So what sort of justification is there for Canada participating, especially financially, with such an organization, in such an organization, without having at least a certain percentage of the vote?
I think it's staggering. It's astounding, the extent to which incumbents are invested in. Board members, including Canada's board member, they do not want to make it look like they were asleep at the switch and didn't see this going on. It was the pandemic. All the meetings were on Zoom. AIIB has a non-resident board. Other MDBs have a resident board where the board directors can see what's going on at headquarters. I believe that there was a vacuum of information at the bank that this caused. I also believe that a lot of the feather-nested, extremely well-compensated expatriates who were there do not want to lose that. And I think that incumbent management don't want to admit that there's something to what I have alleged. So I feel like anyone who has a piece of the bank, like on their resume, anybody who's associated with it now, it's not in their interests to do what I have done.
Vous avez déclaré que la banque.
You have stated that the bank is a resource serving the geopolitical aims of the PRC, the People's Republic of China, that it serves its interests. Do you have any specific examples of projects or decisions made that demonstrate that this is indeed the case?
Again, Mr. Picard, a brief answer, if you could, please.
Thank you, Chair. I think if you look at the countries where the project financing takes place and analyze that with the countries that belong to the BRI and where its bilateral PRC lendings takes place, you'll find a certain significant pattern there. That's what I would emphasize. Also, the selection of where the president of the bank goes, to Hungary to meet with President Orban, for example, or to Serbia, or to meet with countries that appear to be in Central Asia more aligned with Russia and China and the geopolitical situation right now.
Thank you for that. We will now welcome Ms. Ashton, who's subbing in for Ms. McPherson. Ms. Ashton, you have 6 minutes or less.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to indicate that I am a last-minute substitution given the political games being played in the House right now. Certainly will do my best to touch on some of the points here. I understand there was some reference to the AIIB's internal review, and I'm wondering, Mr. Pickford, if you could refer or comment, pardon me, on the fact that the internal review found, among others, that there was no evidence that the AIIB's decision-making organs were unduly and improperly influenced.
Yeah. The internal review was a despicable pack of lies. It was conducted in world record time of 3 weeks. It was not an independent review. It was conducted by a department whose senior leaders were already criticizing me on social media. The day I left the bank, the AIIB said my allegations were baseless. Their report said my allegations were baseless. And I do not believe that they even seriously investigated the core allegations that I made at the time. The internal review also contains factual errors and a variety of other issues that I could raise separately, but I want to be succinct here.
Steve? Well, I mean, we do have some time. What kind of factual errors could you refer to as an example?
Well, for example, the report said that I did not raise concerns about my security, but I raised concerns in writing with the bank's facilities and administration department and with the corporate secretary. And I did so in an email. When Canada expelled that Chinese diplomat back in the spring, I'm just going to turn that off. back in the spring, I sent an email to the president's office of the bank was copied on this. I said, do I have anything to worry about? Should I be concerned with my security? And I got what I consider to be not a very reassuring reply back from the bank's executive in charge of security, who just by sheer coincidence is a member of the Chinese Communist Party and well known to be so inside of the bank. I also, frankly, I contacted the Canadian Embassy, and I said, do I have anything to worry about for my safety in light of the two Michaels? And I can't say that I got any kind of reassurance from them either. So this made me wonder, especially when, keep in mind, I think committee members have to understand, AIIB, they knew of my concerns on the Chinese Communist Party, and they were aware of my plans to inform the Government of Canada of my concern. They knew this for weeks. So I was concerned for my safety in that context because a lot of stuff was going down inside of the bank that didn't make sense to me, and I found extremely unusual based on what had been going on with my own department. I could get into more detail if we have time for it.
Okay. You also referred to a toxic culture within the organization, and one of the most toxic cultures imaginable, which is quite the allegation. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Well, there have been employee surveys done by, is it Mercer that does the HR consulting reports for large complex organizations? It has identified persistently problems, and the Canadian board member would know this, problems with the staff morale and lack of, particularly, number one issue, I think, would be lack of employee regard for the leadership competence of the bank executives. When I first convened an internal town hall meeting of the bank back in July of 2022. We called it Inspire Day. It was an internal communications event. We used a certain technology where staff members, the 500 staff members, could answer polling questions, and we'd see the results on the screen. And right there on the screen were the words toxic culture. So that clearly is evidence of it, and I provided that to the Department of Finance officials in one of the documents I sent them.
And can you confirm that the AIIB's review found that while it found that the culture was not toxic, made several recommendations that would get at the issue of culture?
They said that they would look at that. Yes, they made, but they also took aim at yours truly. I think they felt I was attacking the bank's reputation, so they attempted to undermine my reputation with what I consider some very slimy or low ethics attacks. I mean, they accused me of having disagreements with staff members. Of course, the people who I had disagreements with were members of the Chinese Communist Party who were championing the 3 toxic members in my department who had been harassing and causing problems in the communications function. That detail as well I did provide to the Department of Finance officials during the review.
Ms. Ashton, you're just seconds away from time, so we'll just cut it there. Good, thank you. All right, now to Mr. Chong for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple questions. Thank you, Mr. Pickard, for appearing. The Department of Finance announced a halt to Canadian activity at the bank and a review of the bank, Canada's participation in the bank, when you announced your resignation. How many times have you met with the Government of Canada with respect to their review?
I met with 2 officials in their Elgin Street office during the month of July for a total of 75 minutes. I think it was an hour 15 or so, maybe an hour and a half. And after that point, I emailed a variety of documents or observations as I thought of things, or received messages from staff still at AIIB reporting things I thought they might find of interest.
Okay, and have you met with them in person since that
No.
meeting? Okay. Any other contributions other than providing emails and that 75-minute meeting?
No.
Okay. Do you know anything about the announcement on December 9th, a couple of days ago, from the Deputy Prime Minister announcing a further halt to Canadian participation of the bank and an expansion of the review to include the 4 rubrics of investments, governance, management framework, and response to your resignation? Do you know anything about this extended review?
I saw that, yes. I read it in detail. I shared it on X.
But they haven't contacted you about the extended review yet?
No.
Okay. You know, in paragraph 13 of the AIIB's review of your resignation, they took a shot at you, you know, talking about your workplace behaviors and managerial responsibilities. Perhaps you'd like the opportunity now to respond to what appears to be an attempt to smear your reputation. And you're in front of a parliamentary committee, so your testimony is privileged. You cannot be sued in a court of law for it, so you are free to say what you want here.
The main smear against me was that I had a history of disputes with people in my department, and that I was not processing certain documents or dealing with systems in a timely way. Those were among the issues. They also said that I didn't show up at some key meetings or something. So let me just review those with you briefly. There was one meeting when I was on family. I had to run, my mother is in a cancer hospice here in Ottawa, so I had to fly home to see her, and I was on family leave, and I did not attend an interview with National Public Radio in Washington, D.C. that I had arranged for President Jin. But the interview took place, and he successfully communicated his story during that time. That, to me, speaks to the low character of the bank, that they would do that. I'm also in the communications job. So in the comms job, you know, there's all these media, all these NGO groups, all of these fires to put out. And believe me, in AIIB, there's never a dull moment when it comes to issues to deal with. I should also point out that my department massively increased its budget under my leadership. I got 6 new headcounts. I got approval to build a $500,000 media studio. So I might have been the last one to hand in my promotion request for my staff or my budget requests, but everything got through and everything was done by the deadline. Maybe my other DGs got theirs in first, but I guess I was busier than them.
Were there any other employees of the bank that felt the same way you did?
I know that there are people who feel that way.
At the bank?
Right now, yeah, sure.
They're
Other
just
employees,
not-
you mean?
Yeah, other employees, but they just haven't spoken up about it.
Yes.
Okay.
I do know that. I get emails. There's a spirited discussion on AIIB employee alumni groups. I've been blackballed from joining
Sure.
that.
I have another quick question. About 9 months before you joined, one of the senior people at the AIIB left the door open to lending money to Myanmar's military junta. Did any sort of communications like that take place while you were at the bank?
I don't recall anything dealing with Myanmar. I was asked to meetings to discuss Russian procurement, and there was a debate internally about whether or not there should be a meeting with Russian companies to discuss giving them opportunities to bid on AIIB contracts. And I was asked in no uncertain terms to keep that hush-hush and to ensure that word of it never got known externally. That would be the closest such issue.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Picard. We'll now go to Mr. Oliphant for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you very much. And I want to begin by saying I'm sorry for the journey that you have been through. It sounds like it's obviously been a trying time for you, and so I wanted to express that to you. I want to back up a little bit to you accepting the job. But I know that there are times when the government is asked to promote people's employment in multilateral agencies and banks. Right. Was this a government appointment, or did you apply for a job and get it?
I applied for the job and I got the job.
So,
I applied online, which was the first job I applied online for
well, congratulations. I'm not sure you want to hear that. What did you know about the bank when you were joining it?
I knew that it was designed to be a rival to the World Bank, or so I thought. I thought it was China's way, because the legacy financial institutions, whatever their storied accomplishments are, they did not take into account the rising economic heft of China, which from a Chinese point of view meant they should go and create their own vehicle for multilateralism and show the world that they could convene a multilateral institution that could meet the same requirements of multilateral finance as the Western-based MDBs, but to do so in an Asia-based way consistent with China's geopolitical interests.
So it interested you then in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I worked here in Ottawa. I worked during the Mulroney government. I worked in the Global Affairs Minister's office. I used to work in this building in 1982 for that person. I had for a year, I'd worked in 6 different countries: Singapore, Tokyo, Seoul, New York City. So I felt qualified for the job.
Jumping ahead to leaving the bank, you said just a few minutes ago you left under your own steam, I think were your words, your own reasons rather. Can you explain about your leaving and what was the decision-making process and all of that?
After the President's office became aware of my concerns on CCP influence in the bank, everything from that office towards me changed. The Ombudsman of the bank, himself, I believe, a party member, was undertaking an investigation of my department based on complaints from 3 members of my department who did not subscribe to my leadership. I was trying to modernize the department, bring it into the modern age, but I had 3 people who opposed me because they wanted to keep doing things the way that they had been done.
Were they members of the Communist Party of China?
I don't think so.
Okay, they were not.
No, but they knew that they knew the power structure to go for. And so when everything changed in the president went from don't resign and talking me out of resigning, he went from that to, causing through his office an uncertainty in league with some of these people who were engaging what I can only describe as harassment and divide and conquer.
That makes sense to me. I want to go to after you left, obviously you've said that the day after the government halted all government activity with the bank. There was an internal review in the bank and now an internal review at finance here, which has taken your information. I understand you don't have documentation for them, but you did an interview with them, so a verbal statement.
Verbal, yep.
And now, after several months, Canada is expanding that review to bring in partners, conversations with Australia, Germany, Sweden, and the United Kingdom into a further thing while we continue to halt our activity. Does this make sense to you as an appropriate response for your allegations?
The Department of Finance officials, they already informed me in July that they were in consultation with allies, G7 allies, concerning the matter. That was already known to me. I do believe, based on my close reading of what the government has announced, that the current review, it's not on my allegations per se, it's on a broad range of concerns. And members may not have noticed this kind of detail at the time, but when I left the bank in June, somebody representing the Government of Canada spoke to Bloomberg and made it clear in the reporting that came out that the government, previous to Mr. Pickard's resignation, had certain concerns, including, I believe, about the overconcentration of power in the President's office. So I believe the government, in broadening what it's looking at now, is not just examining what I said, but looking at a whole range of issues that are relevant to whether or not we should remain a member of this.
You have a different partisan background, but it sounds like you feel the government is taking the steps that we need to take, and we're getting somewhere. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you seem to be suggesting that.
I think we're heading in the right direction here on AIIB, and I hope the government pursues this to its logical conclusion.
Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. We'll now go to Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes.
I would like to continue that line of questioning. The government suspended its participation indefinitely. You seem to be optimistic or regarding what has taken place and why.
As a Canadian living overseas under the pressure of that situation, I was and surprised and pleased when the minister announced an immediate review of the situation. So there's no question. I feel like that was a highly supportable decision. And I believe that the current review and the broadening of the review is also a positive development.
You still have.
OK. Croyez-vous que des...
External parties.
Can you please clarify what you mean by external parties?
des gens qui ne sont pas déjà dans...
People who aren't already within the organization itself, I mean.
I don't know. I feel that we have to ask ourselves as a country, if AIIB were founded today under the current geopolitical conditions and with AIIB supporting China's geopolitical interests, would we in other Western countries join this bank? And I don't think so. I hope not. And why would we do that and give the geopolitical credit for their billions in lending to China, to a hostile country that's preparing for war against Taiwan and its Western allies?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Oops, there we go. Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. We'll now go to Ms. Ashton for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Well, a question to Mr. Pickard is there a role in this world for a improved Asian infrastructure bank, given the fact that there are so many countries on the Asian continent that face an immense infrastructure gap, and of course where there is immense opportunity?
It's important for members to realize that most of AIIB's financing is co-financing with existing MDBs, such as the World Bank and the Asia Development Bank. So far, most of AIIB's projects are in the future. I think we have to ask ourselves as a country, support multilateralism, and do we want to finance development projects through a Chinese-dominated multilateral or through a Western or Japanese-dominated multilateral, because those appear to be our current options.
Well, a further question to that is and if I can turn it domestically, I mean, there's been a fair bit of criticism of our own infrastructure bank here in Canada and its governance, lack of transparency, lack of accountability, and the way in which it's not meeting the stated goals, including, so far, real investments in taking on the infrastructure gap that we face in our own country, particularly in Indigenous and Northern communities. So while obviously you've raised particular concerns, one may also note that it's not as though Canada's infrastructure bank is an incredible model when it comes to dealing with or acting on its mandate. And I'll leave it there. I'm not sure if you have any comments to make on that, but it's certainly some food for thought.
We have a lot to learn from China when it comes to building infrastructure. There's no question about it. But they have a lot to learn from us in terms of respect for communities, listening to people affected, and talking about impact to the countries where they're building infrastructure. And are we putting people on a debt treadmill, building debt traps that they cannot escape from? These are some things that are worthy of further conversation.
Good. There we go. We'll now go to Mr. Chong for 5 minutes. Mr. Seaback, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Thank you.
There you go.
Mr. Pickard, given your experience, as you say, with CCP party members in the bank, given what I just gave a brief excerpt of the 2017 National Intelligence Law, do you think that this bank is reformable at all to get out of the yoke of influence of the CCP?
I think Chinese Communist Party members in a subterranean way will always be the power network inside of this bank. Having done business in China since the year 2001, I can tell you this is probably, if there are no Communist Party collaborations in this bank or no informal groupings, it would be the only such organization in all of the PRC that could be said of, and I don't believe that it's so. There may not be like an officially registered party committee or cadre in the bank, but I believe that the operation and the collaboration is very similar to such in a more informal way.
I'm going to press you. I appreciate your answer, but do you think it can it be reformed, given the sort of vast influence you're describing of the Chinese Communist Party within the bank itself, and its influence over Chinese citizens as a result of the national intelligence law?
While they are all on their best behavior in Beijing right now at the bank, I would say that so long as we have the current geopolitical situation and so long as we have the Chinese Communist Party trying to work to undermine Western democracies and to have China replace the United States as the #1 power, it is impossible for that to happen.
Thanks. I want to turn to the bank's report, and I don't want to go to any specific parts of it, but given what you've described, again, as the influence of the Chinese Communist Party, the structure of the bank itself, which I'm sure you're familiar with, what would you say would be the possibilities that their own internal report is going to be fair, balanced, and fulsome?
I would not have confidence in any report coming from that bank. The objectivity, the professionalism, the lack of independence. In my case, the lack of any independent report produced from a department with Chinese Communist Party officials and with senior executives criticizing me publicly while the report's being written. I mean, I would not trust that. I would not trust anything coming from them. And I don't think they have the resources anyway. It's very lean internally. There's not a lot of bandwidth there. It's understaffed.
And so to be clear, this report was an internal report done by, this wasn't external auditors that came in to look at and sort of balance what the bank is saying versus what you're saying.
No.
This was, would you being in the PR business yourself, would you hazard to say that their internal investigation was more of an exercise in PR than it was in fact-finding?
Well, yesterday the Global Times accused me of hype and smears. So I feel like I have some familiarity with this. I feel like that's exactly what they've done to me, leveled various allegations in a hatchet job report. That's what's the expression we should look for? Was it a kangaroo court or is it a snow job? But they did not do an independent report. I refused to participate in that report. They gave me no access to my documents. To the member's earlier question, I couldn't have provided them because they wouldn't let me have them anyway.
So wait a minute. In their own internal report that they wanted you to participate in, they wouldn't give you access to any documents as part of that investigation?
They refused because I wanted access to the documents so that I could create a timeline or provide examples. And I was completely locked out and told that that was not going to happen.
Thank you very much.
And this was done by the Brazilian legal counsel of the bank, Alberto Ninho, at whose home I was supposed to have dinner the weekend I left the bank, actually. I didn't show up for dinner, so he wrote the report saying I didn't show up at meetings.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Seeback. And now for our final portion of this round, we'll go to Madame Lalonde.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for coming in front of us, Mr. Picard. It was mentioned, and I want to take you back on this a little bit more, if you could share some thoughts, that, as we mentioned, the review of Canada's participation in the AIIB has been tasked to the Department of Finance. And I would like you to maybe help us out a little bit further to explain your interaction with the department as part of the review process, but also give us your view on the importance of this review being led by non-partisan professional public servants.
I don't know the people in a three-dimensional or deep way who are conducting this review. We had a single meeting. And while I've been asked to provide information, and always welcome to do so, and there's always been a polite acknowledgement, thank you, Mr. Pickard, for sending this document. Feel free to send any further documents. While that's the case, there haven't been any follow-up questions, and I would say there's been a limited degree of intellectual curiosity in finding out all of the details here. I would have thought, given the sensational nature of some of my allegations, that there might have been more questioning.
Thank you. And I guess it's a perfect segue. So on that note, at any point in your tenure at the AIIB, did you push for any internal reform to address some of the governance issues you have raised since your departure? And did you have any success in these efforts?
Well, on one particular issue, I was certainly a catalyst for urging the bank to take and engage civil society more deeply, and to also address what is really a glaring issue of gender at the bank. So on those two issues, while it wasn't really my remit to tell the bank president or my executive colleagues what to do, I wasn't tasked with the power of recommending a solution. In my department, we were catalysts for taking these functions more seriously, and we advocated.
I'm sorry, maybe. So my understanding is that your department and yourself advocated, but you didn't push for any internal changes. Am I correct? Like, I'm just trying to better understand.
Well, I wasn't, I mean, I pushed for, the ombudsman of the bank was supposed to have published a report, for example, having looked into the situation in my department. 12 of the department's members backed me up. 4, including the one Communist Party member, were opposed. We never heard anything back from that. So I never, and I left so quickly after that, I never had a chance to call for improvement in the Ombudsman office. I would say if I am calling for improvements, it would be in the human resources function, which operates more like kind of a secret police inside of the bank. I would call for improvement in the IT department, which rather than enable communication, which is my job, acted more like a security system, which led to well-known infamous surveillance inside of the bank. So I would call for reforms of that too. And I would also call for reform of the system of non-resident board members. If there were a resident board at this bank where people in Beijing, like at other MDBs, would see what's going on, then perhaps things might have been different.
Thank you very much. I'm going to leave. Is there anything further that you would like to share in front of this committee? Because I think we have about a minute left.
Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody for listening to me. It's a very emotionally charged experience. I had to lay everything on the line for this. So it's been kind of intense for me to talk about this. So thank you for listening. And if you have any follow-up questions, let me know. And if you'd like any further communication, I'm sure the committee staff can give you my particulars.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Pickard. I think for our colleagues here, Mr. Pickard and I share a background in communication. And I dare say if there'd be a lot of communication professionals in Canada and in the United States, or Europe for that matter, that could take the transcript of Mr. Pickard's testimony here, strip out Asian Infrastructure Bank, and insert the name of their company. I have a great deal of empathy for somebody who's in charge of communication for an organization that behaves in a way that you can't, very deep to your core support. Mr. Pickard, thank you for your testimony today, and you leave with our blessings. Thank you. We'll suspend for a few minutes while we switch out panels. So let's call the meeting back into session. I think we may be threading the needle with some votes coming up, so we'll just see what happens, all right? We're pleased to welcome from the Department of Finance, Stephen Kuhn, Associate Assistant Deputy Minister, International Trade and Finance Branch. Your business cards must be about that long. And Julie Trepanier, Director General, International Finance and Development Division. I understand, Mr. Kuhn, you're going to open up for us. You have 5 minutes to deliver some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members. Thank you for inviting us to come and have this discussion today. My name is Stephen Kuhn, and I am the Associate Assistant Deputy Minister for the International Trade and Finance Branch at Finance Canada. And I am accompanied here today by Julie Trepanier, who is the Director General for the International Finance and Development Division within our branch. It's one of my branch's responsibilities to provide oversight of Canada's participation in various multilateral development banks, where the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance serve as governor. These include the World Bank Group, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or the AIIB. As you know, Canada formally joined the AIIB in early 2018, and the AIIB Agreement Act, which is an act of Canadian Parliament, defines the Minister of Finance's role as Canadian governor to the AIIB. Governors in MDBs, in multilateral development banks, including this institution, are responsible for taking the highest level decisions in the governance of these institutions. Since joining the AIIB, my branch has also been responsible for Canada's interactions with the AIIB's management, including through representation on the AIIB's Board of Directors. That Board of Directors is responsible for providing direction for the bank's general operations, such as approving overall strategies, policies, and projects. In this respect, the AIIB's governance structure is largely similar to other multilateral development banks that Canada is a member of, with one caveat being that the AIIB does not have a full-time resident board of directors, as we heard in the previous testimony. Since inception, the AIIB has had a part-time, non-resident board of directors, largely composed of senior finance officials from the largest AIIB shareholders who meet on a regular basis, either in person or virtually. For Canada, this has meant that our representative has been a senior official from within the International Trade and Finance Branch at the Department of Finance, based here in Ottawa. This representative, just to walk through some of the timeline of the discussions we're having today, this representative was informed of the resignation of the AIIB Director General for Communications, Mr. Bob Pickard, by the AIIB's Vice President and Corporate Secretary late on the evening of June 13th. Department of Finance officials, including Canada's then representative to the Board of Directors, had previously not been in contact with Mr. Pickard and had not been informed of the issues surrounding his tenure at the AIIB. I understand that at around the same time, Mr. Pickard informed our Canadian representative in our embassy in Beijing of his resignation and of his plans to immediately return to Canada. Early on June 14th, the Department of Finance learned through Mr. Pickard's posts on his social media accounts of his allegations against the AIIB. Mr. Pickard made several observations about the institution, and he has had the opportunity to discuss these with this committee. Later on that same day, the Deputy Prime Minister issued a public statement immediately halting all Government of Canada activity at the AIIB and instructing departmental officials to lead a review of the allegations raised by Mr. Pickard and of Canada's involvement at the AIIB. Since that time, the department and my branch have been working on this review. The Deputy Prime Minister announced on December 8th that the government is continuing its review of the AIIB in consultation with some of our closest international partners. While this work continues, Canada's participation at the AIIB remains suspended. This concludes my remarks, and Julie and I would be pleased to answer questions that committee members may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kuhn. We'll now go to Mr. Chong for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing. Can you tell us when the review will be complete? And secondly, will the review be made public?
Thank you very much for the question. As was identified in the news release that came out on Friday, the review is, our participation in the bank is indefinitely suspended while the review is ongoing. I do not have a timeline for the completion of the review at this stage.
Can you tell us whether or not the review will be made public?
Whether or not the review is made public or what form the review takes upon its conclusion would be a matter for the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance to decide once we have a chance to.
Thank you. Can you, for the benefit of members of the public who might be watching, can you tell us how much money the Government of Canada has transferred to the AIIB?
Yes. The shareholdings of multilateral development of the international of the AIIB, much like other multilateral development banks, is divided between callable and paid-in capital. So we can have that conversation, but just in terms of the amount of money that has been paid into the institution, the Government of Canada has paid in $159.2 million U.S. currency.
Thank you. Divide by 3 times 4. About $200 million or so Canadian, roughly. So Article 7 of the Articles of Agreement of the bank provides that a member may withdraw from the bank by providing 6 months notice in writing. That article further notes that a member shall remain liable for obligations to the bank to which it was subject on the date the withdrawal notice was submitted. So my question is, if Canada were to withdraw from the bank, what would be the extent of Canada's existing financial obligations to the bank?
I think that there's two important pieces of context that are important to understand. One is that the withdrawal procedures that you see in the Articles of Agreement of the institution mirror withdrawal procedures from various other multilateral development banks of this type. And those procedures have only been used, I think, twice in my knowledge. So Cuba withdrew from the World Bank and the IMF in the mid-'60s. And I believe France withdrew from the Caribbean Development Bank about 23 years ago. And the reason I provide that context is to say that there is a lot of untested legal ground with respect to the withdrawal of any member from the AIIB or other institutions. With respect to the 6-month provision that is in the Articles of Agreement is intended to provide a protection to all shareholders and the institution itself, that if the institution were to face financial difficulty, that members would not be able to instantly withdraw and therefore forego their share of those financial difficulties, which are hypothetical. The AIIB, in this case, is a AAA-rated financial institution from all 3 major debt rating agencies. So I think that the question of that issue of what we would be liable for is a hypothetical question that is not relevant in the current context.
It's safe to say that we wouldn't immediately get back all of the $160 million US dollars that we have contributed to the bank.
What the Articles of Agreement do say with respect to the withdrawal procedures is that a member that withdraws is entitled to, it would have the institution repurchase the shares that it has purchased in that institution. So while those procedures have not been tested, it is our understanding that Canada would receive compensation for the shares that we have purchased to date.
We know that the PRC has set up this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank as a rival to the post-World War II world order to try to displace U.S.-led multilateral institutions. Bretton Woods institutions, post-World War II institutions, this bank being one of their attempts to do that, to offset the World Bank, IMF. Recently, there's a proposal in front of the IMF to increase the quota by 50%. It's a U.S.-led initiative. The PRC is opposed. What is the Government of Canada's position?
The question in front of the IMF right now, as you said, is to increase quota, which is the technical term for vote share effectively at the IMF. That vote is open for governors of the IMF until this coming Friday. And members, including Canada, are continuing to vote through the next couple of days to signal their intent. I have not seen how other countries are voting on that yet. I think that's an open question. So with respect to how other countries will end up voting on that, it is unclear to me. But based on conversations that have been had at the board of directors of the institution, it is our understanding that that vote will pass.
But what is Canada's position?
And Canada has been supportive of an increase of 50% quota at the institution.
Thank you, Mr.
That's all
Chong.
the questions I have, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Just in time, too. We'll go to Mr. Cormier for 6 minutes or less.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. So, to begin, before we get into details about Mr. Picard's testimony, I know there were some problematic aspects of that. I would like to hear you first about the bank. Since 2018, since we've been with it, I'm sure they've accomplished some good work, that there have been some advantages to this for Canadian companies. But could you share with us the projects that have taken place? Have any Canadian businesses been advantaged by the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank's projects? Could you share any of these good stories?
Much for the question, and I think that there are two important elements to the question. The first is with respect to the benefits that the financial institution has had for countries within the region in which it is focused, which is one of the reasons why Canada and other members have joined the institution, is to ensure, as was indicated in Canada's news release at the time of joining the institution, that inclusive economic growth in the region is an objective, and that is something that the institution has been focused on. So in the time that the institution has existed, and it is a very young institution, it has so far provided $35 billion worth of financing for 178 projects in 31 different countries in that region, including about a third of that, $11.1 billion, to alleviate economic and health pressures from COVID. So there is an important story to be told about the success of the institution in that regard. But the question was also about benefits for Canadian companies specifically. And in that regard, there's a couple of things, a couple of points that I would highlight. One is that with respect to contracts earned by Canadian companies, I am aware of four contracts involving Canadian companies for particular projects that the institution has financed, 9 contracts with 5 Canadian companies for corporate procurement within the organization itself, as well as 13 Canadian individual consultants who have engaged in various aspects of the work of the AIIB. And the final note that I would add in that respect is the important role that the Canadian financial sector also has with respect to engagement in the AIIB, noting, for example, that 16% of banking transactions conducted by the institution have been handled by Canadian financial institutions, and Canadian financial institutions have been participating as underwriters on 8 of 10 bond issuances that the institution has engaged in to date.
D'accord, merci pour les clarifications.
Thank you for that clarification. Now, if I think back to Mr. Picard's testimony, the allegations that he shared with us, which are quite serious, when you learned of these allegations, when did you get in touch with him to discuss everything that he was concerned about and the concerns that he was conveying about the bank?
So maybe it's helpful if I just run through the the timeline for mid-June, and Mr. Pickard has done that himself. But just to elaborate on some of those details, I understand his resignation to have occurred on June 12th. And the Canadian government, representatives of our government, were informed by the institution on June 13th, late in the evening the following day. And it was the day after that, then, June 14th, that we first heard why he had resigned and that those allegations that were made in social media were brought to our attention. And it is that same day, on June 14th, that the Deputy Prime Minister announced the halt of Canadian activities at the institution and that the review that we're discussing would begin. With respect to the launch of the review and our conversations with Mr. Pickard, the review did start immediately. June 14th was a Wednesday, and by Friday of that same week, on June 16th, we had reached out to Mr. Pickard to request a discussion with him. The first discussion with him happened on June 20th. That was not an in-person discussion. That was a telephone conference, approximately 30 minutes in length, to start to hear his story and to have a first engagement with him. The longer in-person conversation that we had with him, which is the one I think that he was referencing in his testimony, took place on July 4th. And that was approximately 90-minute conversation, providing him with the opportunity to share his story with us. And subsequent to that, as he noted in his testimony, we have been open and encouraging of him to be able to share information with us, and he's subsequently shared something on the order of 30 emails with us, providing additional observations with respect to his experience.
Parfait. Donc, c'était ma prochaine question, vu qu'il me reste pas beaucoup de temps.
Very well, and that was to be my next question, indeed. So Mr. Picard provided you with evidence of what he was alleging, and you had some emails, I understand. He provided you with emails and some documents about all this?
I think that he addressed this in his testimony as well, but just to emphasize the primary contact that we have had with him and engagement in respect of our review has been oral, including 2 conversations of a total of approximately 2 hours in length, and then subsequent emails that he has sent to us elaborating on his observations and emphasizing some of the details of that oral testimony that he provided to us.
Thank you, Mr. Kuhn. That brings Mr. Cormier's time to a conclusion. We will now go to Mr. Bergeron for 6 minutes or less.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. J'aimerais poursuivre sur cette...
Thank you, Chair. I would like to pick up on that line of questioning, if I may. And I certainly don't want to speak for Mr. Picard, nor have I had a chance to look over anything related to this. But it seems that he said that when he was invited by officials to share his experience, the officials seemed to be not as interested or as curious as he expected. And he had expected that he would be asked to provide more examples that he was not asked to provide. Was there perhaps no interest on your part in looking more deeply into any of the points that he brought up, let's say, in his emails?
As I indicated in my previous answer, we gave Mr. Pickard as much time as he required to provide his part of the story in oral testimony, and invited him to continue to engage with us as he was able to provide more information, and he did so with a number of emails, as I had previously indicated. But what's also important are 2 more facts. One is that he, in the course of that, was not able to corroborate or substantiate his testimony with written documents, and I think that he provided that explanation also in his testimony. But with respect to our subsequent steps of the review that we have been undertaking, he would not be aware of all of the work that we have been doing, including engaging in over 40 of our own interviews with various parties, both within government and outside of government, to try to understand, to try to corroborate the seriousness of the allegations that he's been making, and to find a way forward as part of our ongoing review.
Dans un récent communiqué,
In recent communication, we see that Canada has decided to broaden its investigation. And what is meant by that?
So the member is referring to the news release issued by the Deputy Prime Minister on Friday of last week. And there are 3 bullets in that news release that describe areas where we believe we need to do more work and we need more time to understand the nature of the issues that we have uncovered in our review to date with respect to the AIIB. And so in those 3 bullets, and I'm happy to sort of elaborate on them, are issues with respect to the AIIB that we believe more work is warranted because we have, in our work to date, have identified some weaknesses and some areas for further engagement with respect to the governance of the institution.
À la lumière du témoignage de M. Picard.
In light of Mr. Picard's testimony before the committee and questions that have been put to you, will this broadening of the investigation review lead you to ask more questions of Mr. Picard?
We have continued to keep the door open to conversations with Mr. Picard, and as we continue the review over the coming months, yes, I would certainly welcome further conversation with him to offer him continued opportunity to elaborate on some of the issues that we will be investigating as part of this continuation of the review.
Question. Les États-Unis ont refusé de faire partie.
Another question. The United States refused to join the bank, to contribute to the bank, explaining that they had concerns about its governance, transparency. Shouldn't that have been a warning sign?
At the time that the government chose to join the institution, certainly the United States' position was well known and was considered alongside the other aspects, the beneficial aspects for Canada of joining the institution. And I can't speak for the specific reasons why the Government of Canada chose to make the decisions that it chose, but there certainly are benefits for being part of the institution as well.
Quels sont ces bénéfices?
And what are these benefits?
We've spoken about 2 already in our testimony with respect to the declared interest in the news release at the time of joining the institution when the then Minister of Finance spoke about the inclusive economic growth in the region that could be assisted through this multilateral development bank, which is similar to a core reason why Canada and other like-minded partners engage in a range of multilateral development bank institutions. We also spoke about the commercial opportunities for Canadians and Canadian corporations as a result of participating in the institution. And the third reason that I think is important for us to talk about is that being represented at the AIIB and having our voice at the table allows us to have discussions of issues that are consistent with Canadians' priorities and Canadians' values, and trying to ensure that we're able to speak about those priorities and values as the AIIB considers projects that it chooses to invest in.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. That will do your time for you. We'll now go to Ms. Ashton for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you very much. Well, my first question is on the issue of benefits. From some of the figures that you shared, I mean, simply the fact that 16% of banking institutions or bank transactions, involve Canadian banking institutions. I mean, those are some pretty significant numbers. Could you speak to some of the benefits that Canadian companies are gaining from Canada's involvement in the AIIB?
Thank you. So I previously enumerated a number of contracts that Canadian companies have received from projects and from corporate procurement within the AIIB, as well as individual consultants that are engaged in the work of the AIIB. So those numbers are what they are. I think that they represent a number of Canadians and Canadian companies that are directly benefiting from engagement in the institution. But I also think it's important to continue to emphasize that Canadians receiving benefits from the institution is only one reason why governments such as Canada choose to be members of these institutions. An important reason, but not the only reason.
In terms of specific projects that Canadian companies are involved in, you mentioned that some are related to the post-COVID recovery. Is there a project that you could share as an example of important work being done by Canadian companies through the AIIB?
I'm afraid that I don't have specific details of specific projects that are available, but I would note that every one of the projects that the institution engages in is made publicly available and transparent on their website for anybody who wants to understand those projects and what their purpose is and what they do can gather that information online.
Sure, sounds good. I mean, the fact that you talked about the 16% with respect to the banking transactions, that number certainly is in sharp contrast to the 0.83% of voting shares that Canada has in the organization. It seems for those kinds of shares, that's a significant involvement when it comes to the area of banking transactions. Would you agree that Canada's involvement in terms of these banking transactions is a significant role given Canada's place within the organization, but on the world stage as well?
I noted that number because it jumped out to me as representing one way that Canada is engaged in the work of the institution, and certainly it is larger as a percentage of the transactions that are occurring within the institution than what our vote share is within that organization. But further than that, I couldn't speculate on why the institution has the confidence of Canadian financial institutions to that degree.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to tie into that. I mean, I come from Western Canada, where we know that the Western provinces consider China to be a significant trade partner. In fact, 3 prairie provinces have a trade surplus when it comes to China. My own constituency depends on the trade of agricultural products, mineral products, including nickel from my own hometown. And I'm wondering if it isn't important to continue to engage, not just with China, but also with an institution like the AIIB, given the important trading relationship that Canadian provinces like mine and Canada have with China.
I think the clarification that I would make to your question, if I can, is to draw a distinction between the government of China and the AIIB as an institution. And I know that is a key distinction that we need to be talking about in this conversation. But it is important to recognize that the conversation that we're focused on is about the institution itself and not the government of China. And in that respect, I have a mandate and knowledge to speak to Canada's engagement with that institution. But for conversations about trade relationships on a bilateral basis with the government of China, those questions would have to be referred to Global Affairs Canada.
Fair. It just strikes me that the entire premise of this conversation is around the accusations of China's involvement in the AIIB and hence the review. So just to confirm, Canada's review of the AIIB was based on a Facebook post of a former employee that decided to leave. Is that in terms of the actual timing of the calling of the review?
The review was launched by the Deputy Prime Minister once she was made aware of serious allegations that were made by a Canadian employee who worked at the institution. And those allegations were made known to us for the first time on Twitter, as it turns out, but on social media. So yes, we did launch the review on the basis of serious allegations raised by an employee of the institution.
thank you for sharing that. As somebody who spends some time on Twitter, obviously there's a lot there, but appreciate what you've shared today, and certainly looking forward to tracking down some more information around Canadian companies' involvement and hence benefits as a result of their involvement in the AIIB. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ashton. We'll now go to Mr. Seaback for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So you've talked about in your statement and in answering to questions, you've talked about Canada's participation in the AIIB helps to promote inclusive global economic growth. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Uyghur forced labor. And so there's the UFLPA entity list the United States has put out, which contains a list of companies that the United States has determined uses forced labor from the Xinjiang region to mine, produce, or manufacture goods. Does the Government of Canada have a system in place to make sure that any investments that our money went into through the AIIB, that no projects that the bank has provided financing for violated the UFLPA entity list?
Thank you for the question. And the issue of forced labor is an important one, especially when we're having conversations about Canada's engagement in the AIIB. And I would note that it is an important one that has been on our radar longer than the time period of the review that we are engaged in. I'd note, for example, that it is an issue that the Deputy Prime Minister was raising as governor of the institution even last year in 2022 as part of her role as governor of the institution. And as the previous testimony noted as well, Canada's director on the board of directors has also been raising this issue with his counterpart directors around the table at the AIIB in respect of specific projects.
I understand raising an issue. That's one thing. I'm raising an issue right now. But there's a difference between raising an issue and actually assuring Canadians, parliamentarians, that no Canadian funds that went to the AIIB ended up financing projects that used Uyghur forced labor. And it's not hard to do. There's an entity list that the U.S. has published, readily available. I've raised it with the Trade Minister many times. Did the Government of Canada ensure that no funds from the AIIB that were invested or used to finance a project were given to companies on the UFLPA entity list? If you don't know, you can say I don't know. If the answer is no, you can say no, or you can say yes, we did. I don't want to hear about processes. I want to know if we did it, we don't know we did it, and if there's a process in place to make sure we didn't.
So, Mr. Chair, I think that the answer is it's an important question, and it just requires a little bit of context in understanding how the finances of a multilateral institution work. And two respects are important. One is that our capital that we provided to the institution is not itself directly invested in specific projects. It is used to leverage on the financial markets those bond issuances that are themselves lent into projects. The second element that is important and is important for this conversation is the fact that Canada is a less than 1% shareholder at that institution, and therefore, when speaking about projects is important, but we do not have the ability ourselves to veto projects that are considered by the board.
Good. I understand that. But is there a system in place to check where the funds from the AIIB are being invested to make sure that companies on the UFLPA entity list can't get access to those funds through bonds, through any other financing? Does the Finance Department in Canada have a system in place to make sure that those companies can't access those funds through the AIIB? It's a yes or no.
I'm afraid that I can't answer specifically to the question because I'm not familiar with the UFLPA list specifically.
Okay. Would there be someone else at the department that would be familiar with that? Because I think you're pretty senior in the government.
That's a question that I would need to check internally.
Well, I would like you to give an answer in writing to the committee whether or not the Government of Canada has in place a system to ensure that any projects financed by the AIIB do not get companies on the UFLPA entity list do not get financing. Do I have? Okay, thank you.
Right, thank you, Mr. Seaback. We'll now go to Ms. Yip for 5 minutes. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm just going to take 1 minute with Ms. Yip's
As you will.
permission. I just wanted to clarify, have the witnesses clarify that the legislation that the member from the opposite side is referring to is not Canadian legislation, it's American legislation. And under what authority would Canada be required to follow American legislation? Or are we still sovereign? I mean, I'm just trying to understand. This is American legislation. Is that correct? And would it apply to Canada?
As I had indicated to the previous member, I'm not familiar with legislation of other countries and how it would apply to various institutions. And of course, the United States is not a member of the AIIB either. But with respect to specific issues of other countries outside of Canada, I would invite the members to speak with Global Affairs Canada about those issues.
Thank you.
Speaking of other countries, there's 109 countries that make up the AIIB, and how have the other member countries reacted to the allegations? And what actions have they taken?
Thank you for the question. I don't want to generalize across all 108 other member countries of the institution, but it is fair to say
Countries rather than an overall generalization.
it is fair to say that we have, as part of our review to date, we have been speaking with countries that are both regional countries in the Asia region and non-regional countries, borrower countries, non-borrower countries. And there have been a number of issues that have been raised in the review so far that have resonated with a number of those countries. The news release that was issued on Friday named 4 countries in particular as countries that with whom we have been having significant conversations and will continue to have significant conversations, among others, as the review continues. It's important to recognize that those countries that have been named and many others who were engaged with, that being named does not mean that they fully agree with the allegations that have been made by the institution, nor with the review that we're undertaking or the steps that might come from the review. But their participation does signal that they think that there are some important questions that need to be addressed and that they're willing to work with us in that regard.
What are the 4 countries?
So the press release on December 8th identified Australia, Germany, Sweden, and the United Kingdom just as 4 examples of countries that, in that particular case, we had conversations about this issue in Marrakesh at the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF, where these conversations occur.
Are we working with them for some sort of review?
We are having ongoing conversations with them and with a number of other countries to try to understand really what is behind the allegations and the specific issues that we have identified as being as meriting further discussion. So yes, we continue to have conversations. In fact, Patrick Haley, who is our Assistant Deputy Minister, also responsible for this review, is in Brasilia right now, where he will be meeting with G20 counterparts, as well as a number of these countries, to continue that conversation with them this week, as well as in the coming weeks and months ahead.
So we talked about Canada's indefinite pause at the AIIB. How long has this pause been in effect? How long will it continue?
The pause took effect on June 14th. And what the press release on Friday was making clear from the Deputy Prime Minister is that the pause will continue until the review has had a chance to complete itself. And the fact that the review is continuing is representative of the seriousness of the allegations that we have received, that we've heard, as well as some of the questions that we think that warrant further work as we progress through the review.
So you wouldn't know how long this review would take?
No, there's no fixed timeline for the review at this stage. The review will conclude when we're satisfied that we have.
Thank you, Ms. Yip. That's your time. We'll go now to Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes.
Il semble y avoir un fossé.
There seems to be quite a gap between your evaluation and that arrived at by Mr. Picard regarding the consequences, the effects of Canada's participation in this bank. You seem to see advantages, benefits. He seems to see an institution that is serving more than anything the interests of the People's Republic of China. So is serving China's interests an advantage for Canada?
The AIIB is a multilateral organization, and the 109 members of the institution, like Canada, are making choices to participate in the organization because they see something of benefit to themselves. I think that it's fair to say that all 109 members are making decisions to participate in that institution as a result of their own interests and how those interests can play through the institution. It is, I think, an important point to recognize, as we have been discussing through this testimony, that China is the largest shareholder of the institution. In fact, their voting share of the institution is nearly 27%. That is by design and by agreement, and from that perspective, they do have a particular role to play in the institution that is different than smaller shareholders.
Il est bien évident, ça c'est une vérité de la palisse.
All right, well, everyone knows that, but it's pretty clear that when you join an organization that you hope that it's going to be advantageous to you, but when you undertake an evaluation based on allegations, very concerning allegations, that can lead to reevaluating the view of the advantageousness of a prior action. I'm not hearing that from you. Let me go back to what Ms. Yip just brought up. In your recent news release, yes, indeed, we can see these exchanges with Australia, Sweden, the UK. Would you say that our colleagues in these countries are also concerned, have the same concerns that have led the Government of Canada to indefinitely suspend its participation in this bank?
Thank you for the question. Just one point that I would like to clarify with respect to the question before going to it directly is that the review is ongoing. And so if I leave the members with the impression that the Government of Canada has reached conclusion with respect to elements of the testimony, I apologize for that. The review is ongoing, and we continue to be looking at various elements of it. With respect to other countries and their perspectives on these issues, I don't think it's for me to speculate on what specific issues they may or may not share with us with respect to the institution, or how their governments may be thinking about their continued involvement in the institution.
Mr. Bergeron, I'm sorry, your time has expired.
Oh, dommage.
So unfortunate.
I've been very kind to you tonight. Ms. Ashton, you have 2.5 minutes.
Okay, well, first of all, while you were speaking, I did have a chance to do a cursory review of projects that have been approved by the AIIB, I guess, over the last couple of years. And I saw a reference to water efficiency, Women's Economic Empowerment Fund, emergency and crisis response facilities, the strengthening of vaccination and health systems under the COVID-19 Strategic Preparedness and Response Project, reference to wind energy projects, urban transit, earthquake relief, and these were in a range of countries around the world. these seem to be pretty important projects relating to life and death matters in some of the poorest countries in the world. Is this some of the work that, to your knowledge, the AIIB is involved with?
Yes, absolutely. I think as you look through and as others look through that list of 178 projects that they've invested in to date, I spoke earlier about the government's desire to engage inclusive economic growth in the region as being a motivator for participating in the AIIB. And I think your recital of that list from the website provides a clear articulation of some of the benefits of engaging in those projects, again, across 31 countries in a region that has been identified as being a priority region for the Government of Canada's international engagement.
And to the question around the voting shares, which has come up numerous occasions, are the voting shares not in part related to the total subscriptions in the institution?
There are two elements to that answer that I would say. Absolutely yes. The amount of paid-in capital that members need to provide are in direct proportion to that voting power that they have. But that is also the fact of those voting shares is something that that has been negotiated and is well known and is transparent for all members.
Okay, so just to clarify, when we talk about China's voting shares, it's also a reflection of the significant subscription it holds compared to, say, Canada, for example, that has a much more reduced share. And finally,
I'm sorry, Ms. Ashton. I'm sorry, your time has expired.
Okay,
but
that's fine.
save
Thank
it.
you.
I think we should be able to get back to you before we're finished here. We'll now go to the next couple of speakers. We'll have Mr. Seeback, followed by Madame Lalonde, and then if we get to a third round, we'll have 5 minutes for the Conservatives, 5 minutes for the Liberals, and then 2.5 minutes each for the Bloc and the NDP. So, Mr. Seeback, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm going to go back to the Uyghur forced labor issue. So Mr. Oliphant pointed out that was an American list. Yes, it is, because we don't have a list in Canada of banned entities. Despite the United States doing diligent research, Canada's not done any. So we don't have a list. But we do know that Canada is legally obligated under CUSMA to not allow for the importation of goods made with forced labor. You're aware of that, is that correct?
My mandate does not include CUSMA specifically, but so no, I'm not aware of that.
Okay, well, that is what we are legally obligated, not to allow for the importation of goods made with forced labor. That's the law in Canada. Canada has not seized a single shipment of goods coming from the Xinjiang region of China or anywhere else. And in fact, the United States is now urging Canada to stop the importation of goods made with forced labor because we've become a dumping ground for those goods because the United States has banned it. Which takes me back to the question of the AAIB. So do we have any protocols in place to ensure that companies that use Uyghur forced labor don't get financing from the AAIB?
As a multilateral institution, Canada participates on the board of directors of the institution, and as one of, we're not on the board of directors at the moment, but when we were on the board of directors before the pause started, we were a voting member making decisions with respect to the projects that the institution proceeds with, but we were only one voting member, and the vote share across the institution is such that Canada does not have a veto on particular projects that are approved by the institution, much as it doesn't have a veto at any multilateral development banks at which we're members. So while we can raise issues and we can attempt to find like-minded partners at the board table who can also raise issues with us, we do not have the vote share necessary to block individual projects ourselves.
So we don't know if funds used at the AAIB have been used by companies accused of using Uyghur forced labor. We don't have a system in place to look into that.
I am aware that there are instances of projects that have been approved by the AIIB where Canada and other partners around the board have raised questions about forced labor, and where Canada's engagement has not allowed for those projects to be blocked as a result of that.
So those projects went ahead then?
Yes.
So then we do know that, because we're an investor in this, we're a shareholder in this bank with Canadian taxpayer dollars, so then we can conclusively say that Canadian taxpayer dollars, to some extent, could be a very small amount, were used to finance projects where there was an accusation that a beneficiary of that financing was engaging in the use of Uyghur forced labor.
What we can say is that we engage in a multilateral setting through that institution, and that Canada does not have a veto on individual projects that are approved by the board of directors.
Went ahead, despite Canadian objections that there was potentially Uyghur forced labor.
There are 178 projects on
I know
the
that
website.
you just said it before. You just said it before that there were ones that you objected to, but they went ahead.
There have been projects where we have raised questions about forced labor. I do not know specifically.
Well, could you actually table with this committee the projects that Canada objected to as a result of their concern that the finances were going to companies that use forced labor?
Yes, I can do that.
Thank you very much. I just now want to go back to prior to Mr. Pickard's revelations, did the Government of Canada have any concerns about the governance structure at the AAIB, the fact of the 2017 National Security Law, the encroachment of the CCP in the bank?
There's a range of issues that are being discussed as part of the review, and there are a number of those issues that have been on our radar and have been considered, and that we have been pushing through the governance channels of the institution for some time. I was not specifically aware of the allegations that Mr. Pickard has made with respect to the employees of the institution and whether or not they are members of the China Communist Party. And we have asked for evidence of that, and we do not have evidence of that at this stage.
Can you table
Thank you,
whatever these concerns that have been raised, if they're in writing or internal to the government, can you please table those concerns for the committee as part of this study? Can I get a yes or no?
Sure.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Seebeck. We'll now go to Ms. Lalonde for 5 minutes or less.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair.
I think you were trying earlier, and maybe my colleague raised the same sort of line of questions, but I just want to hear clearly. Certainly the allegation that Mr. Pickard's raised are very serious. And during any of the conversation with him, what sort of concrete electronic or physical evidence has he provided to the department?
Thank you. They are important issues that he has raised. But it's also important to note that his testimony, as he said himself, was oral, was backed by a number of emails that he provided that emphasized his points, but he was not able, by his own testimony, to provide written or documentary evidence to corroborate or substantiate the most serious allegations that he has been making.
Thank you very much for this. I know you were trying earlier to say this, but so I want to take you back on the and maybe before I do this, if I was to ask you to clarify, you also made reference to emails that he's referenced as a narrative observation from him. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. I want to take us back to certainly the Government of Canada's position, and certainly what does it means when we say that we have an indefinite pause of Canada's activity at the AIIB. How long has this pause been in effect, and what does that mean exactly, Mr. Cohn?
Thank you. The pause has been in effect since June 14th. That was the date of the original announcement by the Deputy Prime Minister. And that has meant a couple of very concrete things for us. First of all, as I alluded to in one of my previous answers, it has meant that we have not participated in Board of Directors meetings since that time, and we have not participated in the annual meetings of the institution since that time. In fact, it means that the employee on my team who had been assigned to be the alternate director, the board representative on that institution, is no longer in that position, and our board seat at the institution, our alternate director seat, is vacant. It has also meant that while we have made 4 capital payments into the institution, we have withheld the 5th capital payment that is now overdue and will not make that payment while this pause is in effect.
Okay, thank you very much again for that answer. And last but not least, you did mention that the Canada was, and I'm looking at my French here, donc je vais y aller en français.
So I'll continue in French. When we were questioning you about the government partners that you're working with, so who are you working with to fill in information and arrive at decisions?
So, and just to clarify, is the question about other government partners or the breadth of partners that we have been working with on the review?
Yes.
Maybe it's helpful just to lay out some of the elements of the review that we've been undertaking so far, because I haven't had the opportunity to do that. Since speaking with Mr. Pickard, who was one of the first interviews that we had in June, we have engaged in some 40 other interviews as well, including current and former employees of the institution, Canadians who work at the institution or have worked at the institution. We have been speaking with Government of Canada expertise as well, including at Global Affairs Canada. We have been speaking with the security and intelligence apparatus within Canada, as well as a number of allies, partners, and members. But we've also, in addition to those 40 or more interviews that we've engaged, we have also been reviewing public records, records from the institution. Mr. Pickard, in his testimony, referenced employee surveys. We've been looking at those employee surveys and comparing those to employee surveys of similar institutions, just as one example of the kinds of records that we have been examining as part of the review.
And maybe I was not clear, but to which extent have you been working with the international partners as your review?
We have had quite a number of conversations with international partners, and as I said in a previous answer, that includes some traditional like-minded allies, but also a breadth of other countries around who are members of the institution and have views and to provide for the review. Unfortunately, I'm not able to speak about the specific countries other than those who have chosen to be named as part of the announcement that was on Friday, and others are working more quietly behind the scenes to help us through some of the questions that are outstanding.
Thank you, Ms. Lalonde. That is your time. We'll now go to Mr. Chong. Now, we're going into the third round. We'll have 5 minutes for Mr. Chong, 5 minutes for Mr. Fragascaros, 2.5 minutes for Mr. Bergeron and Ms. Ashton. And following that, there may be a little time left. And so if there's interest, we can have one question from each party represented here, and that will wrap it up if there's interest in doing that. All right. But Mr. Chong, the next 5 minutes is yours.
Well, thank you. I want to talk about AIIB's financing of projects. a couple of years ago, a senior member of AIIB, as reported in the Financial Times, a reputable publication, said that the bank was open to funding projects in Myanmar's military junta, which is not something the Government of Canada supports. How is the government reconciling its position with membership in a development bank where senior members of the bank openly muse about funding projects in jurisdictions like Myanmar?
Thank you for the question. We're not aware of the IB being open to new projects with the junta in Myanmar, and we would certainly, if it was the case, or if any project would have been brought to the board, we would have certainly.
Appreciate that answer. Let me give you some other examples that have actually happened. In 2020, a number of non-governmental organizations accused the AIIB of violating human rights and environmental standards in India when 103 families were forcibly moved to make way for a metro rail project funded by the AIIB. In the same year, similar allegations about a lack of environmental standards was made with respect to an AIIB project funded in Bangladesh, which was the Bola power plant, where a flood occurred and a number of workers died. A year later, the High Commissioner on Human Rights the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights stated that human rights have been violated in Indonesia's Mandalika tourism project, which was also funded by the AIIB, particularly with forced displacement of people and forced resettlement. And then more recently, there's been civil society organizations of alleged predatory and abusive collection practices with regard to microfinancing a project in Cambodia that the AIIB funded. So with all these projects, there seems to be a pattern emerging about a different style of governance as compared to, multilateral organizations, development banks like the World Bank. In all these cases, how can that kind of funding of those kinds of projects be consistent with the government's stated foreign policy priorities?
The AIIB has invested in 178 projects, and that's a project count that I have before we paused our work. And of course, over the last 6 months, we haven't been engaged in reviewing projects or participating in project approvals. I can't speak to the specifics of those projects, including whether or not they were considered at the AIIB before or after the pause that we've engaged in. But what I can say is that, as was presented by the testimony of Mr. Pickard, as the AIIB is a young institution, it's about 7 years old, one of the ways that it has been engaging in project investment decisions is by doing it alongside other more mature organizations like the World Bank or like the Asian Development Bank. And in fact, more than half of the projects that it invests in are done alongside those other institutions that have longer track records with respect to these issues.
Yeah, I've just enumerated 4 projects. 4 out of 178 is over 2%. It's not insignificant. It seems to fit into a model of what the Obama administration predicted, which was that this was going to be a sort of a strategy by the People's Republic of China to export its authoritarian model of governance throughout the Indo-Pacific region. And seeing projects like this getting funded through a very different lens of human rights, protection for the environment, a very different lens of due process and procedural fairness for those communities affected. It seems to me that, those predictions have come true. And so is the review that...
I'm sorry, Mr. Chong, your time has expired, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you, Mr.
All right.
Chair.
We'll go to Mr. Fragaskatos for 5 minutes.
Thank you to both of you for being here today. My question will be very general, but I think for those watching, I think is instructive. And that is, why does Canada participate in initiatives such as this? What was the underlying purpose of the movement towards engaging with the AIIB?
Thank you. There are three general reasons why Canada and other members engage in multilateral development banks, including the AIIB. The first is, as I have said, and as was set out in the news release from when Canada joined this institution, is out of a desire to help foster inclusive economic growth in that region. So in this particular case, the Asian region, which is consistent with the Indo-Pacific strategy and other foreign policy priorities of the government. The second key reason why Canada would engage in multilateral development banks, including this one, is to ensure that discussions that happen at those board tables take into account issues of Canadian priorities and Canadian values. So that includes issues of forced labor, as we've been talking about. It includes issues of environmental protection. It includes issues of gender equality, and I could name a couple of others. The important issue is not that we are able to veto every project with which we don't agree, but that we're able to make sure that there are conversations about Canadian priorities and values in those projects as they're considered by the institution. And then the third reason, of course, as we've discussed, is for commercial opportunities that benefit Canadians as a result of our engagement in the institution.
But eyes are wide open with respect to this particular iteration of Chinese leadership. This is not the China of 10 years ago even. Things have changed dramatically. And so, and this is something that this committee has understood time and again. And what would you say in recognition of that? Because I do see you agreeing. What would you say in recognition of that Canada is doing to plant itself or to position itself in response to changing dynamics in China as far as its particular approach to international engagement?
Well, I think that there are a number of instances of conversations or debates that Canada has had at the board table of the AIIB, where we have been successful in building coalitions around that table and moving the institution in ways that are not aligned with what China might have wanted, notwithstanding the fact that they are the largest shareholder. I think about the policy, for example, in a couple of years ago that the AIIB has now announced to not invest in coal projects or related coal infrastructure as part of a climate policy. That happened because Canada has been at the table and pushing on that important issue. The AIIB's treatment of Russia in the context of Russia's aggression on Ukraine is another example that has been that has only occurred as a result of Canada's leadership there. For example, in 2022, the annual meetings were supposed to happen in Russia and in Moscow, and we were able to build a coalition around the institution to make sure that that did not happen. And the activities of the institution in respect of Russia are also on hold indefinitely. Those are things that happen because we are at the table, because we're having conversations, difficult conversations. And no, we don't win every conversation that we have. That's the nature of working in a multilateral setting, but we do have those conversations, and that's an important first start.
I have 40 seconds left, Mr. Kuhn. The point on building coalitions, I think, is a very important one. So we are working with like-minded countries in that context of the AIIB to, if not push back, if that's not the right phrase, then certainly present an approach that is in line with liberal democratic values?
Yes, that is a key reason why we engage in an institution like this.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. We now have Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes.
Ben, je vais poursuivre sur la même veine.
Well, I'll pick up on that, and also where I left off last round with my question about the discussions which took place with your counterparts of Germany, Australia, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. You said that you could not speculate on these matters, and I'm not asking you to do so. I'm asking you to merely work based on those discussions with your counterparts, not you personally, but which our representatives have had with their counterparts of Australia, Sweden, Germany, the United Kingdom. There were common concerns expressed, and have there been common concerns expressed about this problem?
I think perhaps the easiest way to understand the engagement of other countries is to start also by recognizing the internal review that we heard testimony about previously, that the AIIB is conducting in respect of some of the issues that have been identified. And those partners who continue to be engaged at the board of directors of the institution while Canada steps away from that board are looking at that review and are trying to hold the institution to account on issues of governance and culture and the complaints mechanism and HR issues. Those matters are the focus of that review and some of the issues that those countries are engaged in. And for us, for our review, we've said, yes, those 19 recommendations that have been put forward and are being looked at and examined by the board are important, but they're not sufficient. They do not fully satisfy the extent and the seriousness of the allegations that have been put forward. And so we need to layer on top of that some additional areas of review, some additional elements that we would like to undertake as part of the continuation of our own review. So those four partners and others that we've been speaking with do share commonalities across some elements of those review. But what I wouldn't want to speculate on is whether or not they share all of the elements of the review that we have underway.
Est-ce que d'autres pays ont pris un pas de recul?
Have other countries stepped back from what's going on at the investment bank?
That has taken the type of measure that we have taken at this point in time.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. We'll now go to Ms. Ashton for 2 minutes and 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. In terms of the review that you're conducting, are you also speaking with Canadian companies, contractors that work with the AIIB or work on projects approved by the AIIB?
The review is underway. Of the 40 interviews that we've conducted to date, we have not yet reached out to particular Canadian companies who are benefiting from the institution. But the review is continuing, and we still have work to do.
Mm-hmm. Because it seems to me, and obviously I'm not a permanent member of this committee, we're discussing the projects without and potential, one would hope, potential benefits to Canadian companies, but not actually hearing from said companies. So we're clearly missing an entire piece here, and which relates to one of the three key tenets of why Canada is engaged in an institution like the AIIB. I want to go back to that question of values. We know that, again, you mentioned is one of the three reasons why we engage with institutions like the AIIB and others. One Canadian value it's been thrown around today is that of multilateralism. And, one will note that multilateralism doesn't mean that we always agree with each other, Canada and China can have disagreements. Canada and other countries can have disagreements, but there is value in working together and recognizing that China is one of our major trading partners, that there are incredible economic opportunities, it seems, for Canadian companies to engage in projects in the AIIB. Would you agree that that it is beneficial for Canada to engage in multilateral institutions, and that kind of engagement is beneficial to obviously not just people overseas, but to Canadians as well?
Yes, I would agree. I think that there are clear examples of the benefits that have been brought to the AIIB as an institution and the projects that it is financing as a result of Canada's approach to multilateralism.
And just a quick question, there was some reference to problematic projects regarding displacement. I certainly represent an area that's been ravaged by hydroelectric development that displaced thousands of Indigenous peoples and destroyed the environment. Obviously, that was not part of the AIIB. That was a Canadian government that went forward with this kind of a project. But I'm wondering, to the broader question, some of the projects that I've seen on the website are, we're talking about life and death issues. Do you think that Canadians would see it as important to invest in these kinds of initiatives on the ground, whether it's health or, frankly, climate?
I can't speak on behalf of Canadians, and that's not my job to do. But certainly when I look at the project list of the AIIB, I think that there are important projects that are happening as a result of that institution. That is not to say that that we have a conclusion with respect to what the Government of Canada's engagement is with the institution. I need to emphasize that the review is ongoing and that we do not have declared positions on some of these issues. I think that the review is complex. It is sensitive, and even this conversation that we're having today is an important one for us to be able to take note of the concerns that people have with respect to the institution and how it operates.
All right. This brings us to the end of our third round. Now, I don't want to shortchange the committee. There's probably about 3 or 4 minutes left to take us to the full 90 minutes. We want to get our money's worth out of Madame Trepanier. And yes.
Takes us till 6 o'clock, and I believe it is now after 6.
Yes, we started late. We started late, Mr. Oliphant. So again, in the issue of fairness, I just wanted to, as I say, not shortchange the committee. If there are further questions, we have a motion to adjourn. All right. Thank you. And listen to all of you before I drop this. Have yourself an absolutely Merry Christmas. Thank you again to our analysts, our clerk, and no, we won't, and our interpreters and all of the staff who support us. Hope you have a wonderful Christmas season. Meeting adjourned.